It's good to be here.
Well, I have to tell you, I've been laughing every time we've been playing this, and behind the scenes, you can't hear me, but the humana. I mean, it's great.
And then the anchor starts the segment and goes, "Oh, I love that bit." That's on MSNBC. She's doing a racism, folks, and then she continues to interview this absolute moron who obviously his dev career did not take off from there. But at the time, that got you on cable news to murder Saddam in a video game and have MSNBC pimp your game out. By the way, I looked up the guy, the game developer there, and would it surprise you to know he is not making video games, but is a giant MAGA guy who is posting incessantly about how AOC is a dumb broad who needs to, he'll tell her what's what.
When I look at this thing, what you've created, and it's like, look at this. Yeah, nice job, none of you.
So let's talk about, if you will, the cast of characters that we're going to meet and spend some time with during the show, because they're all very colorful. First up, obviously, there's Saddam.
Right.
We're going to start the show in Iraq, and we're going to obviously see him wear a lot of different hats and go through a lot of different changes.
Saddam was born in 1937, and he grew up in the middle of Iraq in a pretty poor place. He grew up near the town of Tikrit, in central Iraq, from a fairly young and early age, involved in Arab nationalist efforts to, claw back Iraq from colonial powers. And, he was involved in assassination attempts. He was a pretty well-connected guy and had a reputation as a thug. I mean, he was reputed to have committed his first murder while he was still a teenager.
Yeah. Also, as we'll see, as an interesting part of the politics that shape Iraq in the 20th century before Saddam takes power, big anti-communist.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
the Ba'ath Party were, we're going to get into the Cold War stuff, but Saddam was a nationalist. He may have been anti-British, but he was no fan of the Reds.
Right. And, this is also part of what explains his rise to power. The fact that he was such a diligent and effective anti-communist helps explain why he was able to become the strongman that he was in the 70s.
And why we liked him so much.
Exactly.
Also, Saddam had, we don't get to this stuff as much just because, you got to make some choices, but he had a very soap opera family arrangement. There was a lot of drama. Saddam had two sons, his heirs, Qusay and Uday. Qusay was like the straight-laced. He was pretty competent. Uday was a complete fucking monster.
He was a psychopath.
He was like Ralph Cifaretto, just like, honestly, like a huge sex criminal, would shoot people at parties for fun. Exactly what you think of as like a dictator's spoiled brat kid who inflicts only pain and misery upon everyone around him. It was a very bargain mafia show type drama. And in fact, HBO did make a
really bargain soap opera.
It wasn't great.
Not good.
It was called House of Saddam. It ran on HBO in the mid-2000s.
Although, let's be clear, it is like a delicious kind of irony that they got an Israeli who is, like an Arab Israeli who's a good actor, but an Israeli nonetheless to play Saddam.
Yeah.
Saddam, though, is, I guess you could look at the biggest winner in the second half of the 20th century in Iraq. But that also meant that there were people who lost out pretty big and who would spend the rest of their lives trying to plot against Saddam and who might see an opportunity when we started grumbling about going to war against Saddam in the early 2000s.
Enter a certain man named Ahmed Chalabi.
What role would you like to play in any new government? If you were asked to run to be the new leader of Iraq, would you accept?
It's not about me personally. I do not want to answer this hypothetical question.
Chalabi was an Iraqi exile. He split the country after a revolution that happened in the 50s in Iraq. Saddam stayed and took over eventually. Chalabi swore one day he would come back and he'd take over. He was the model of one of those guys, an exile who lives in the West after a revolution happens in their country, who then becomes a very, very willing partner of the CIA or the State Department, DOD. Chalabi was all three of them at different points of his career. And he was the guy who, more than anyone else outside of the American government, was in it to win it against Saddam and helped us do it.
And he was himself like this totally like strange and colorful character, right?
Very, very. I'd say he's a Coen Brothers character brought to life. There should be some biopic about him, although I wouldn't trust Hollywood to do it, but someone should do it. The Safdie brothers should do it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, like how so?
So first off, to give you a sense of him, everyone knows what Saddam looks like. But Chalabi, I have to say, if you had to cast him, I would go, he looks like John Lovitz.
All right, well, I'm sorry, all right? I guess I was just thinking of myself.
He's an Iraqi John Lovitz. He's short, squat, kind of frumpy looking, but he had very good taste. He was very erudite. He was very sophisticated. He came from this rich, wealthy business family. That was why he fled Iraq when this populist revolution happened in the 50s. And he could recite poetry. He could rattle off a bunch of trivia about the Japanese Empire.
Wasn't he like a mathematician or something?
After he left Iraq, he grew up in Lebanon for a bit and became a professor of mathematics in Lebanon. He would later then claim that he invented some code breaking thing that his colleague did or a mentor of his did, which goes to show how genuinely the raw intelligence he had and then the raw malfeasance that was attached to that intelligence. So yeah, a total flim-flammer his whole life, just one of the great con men of all time, because as we'll follow him throughout the show, he keeps bouncing back. He gets kicked out of his country. He bounces back. He makes a bank in Jordan. He starts to steal a shitload of money, millions of dollars from Jordan. He bounces back. He gets a job with the CIA trying to overthrow Saddam. He fucks up his chances with the CIA, gets kicked out, comes right back, gets in there with the Bush administration, and then lands in Iraq in 2003, ready to take over. So he's one to watch.
Freedom's untidy, and free people are free to make mistakes and commit crimes and do bad things. They're also free to live their lives and do wonderful things.
Probably the most famous bureaucrat of the Iraq War was Donald Rumsfeld.
The face of the war, really.
I mean, yes, exactly.
Anytime in the show where you hear like a clip of someone on a podium from the Bush administration and their whiny, smug little voice, it's Rumsfeld.
And it's funny because he actually didn't begin his political career as a hawk, actually.
Yeah.
You know, Rumsfeld, he began his political life fairly young in the 60s as a congressman from Illinois. And he was a fairly moderate guy. He, was pro-choice. He co-sponsored the Freedom of Information Act. And then he joined the Nixon administration.
He was also actually pressing to